good evening, depending on where you are. Today, we're very lucky to have at the International Institute for Strategic Studies two well-informed speakers on the subject of China's cyber coercion. Thank you for joining us. This event is part of a new project that we've got at IISS on this subject. We're looking both at the great powers and some smaller states. Focus for the great powers for the moment is on Russia, China and the United States, and we're doing some work also on Iran and North Korea. We'll extend that work to other countries as we get deeper into the project. Let me introduce our speakers for this evening. We have Mark Manantan, who is the Lloyd and Lillian Vasey Fellow at the Pacific Forum and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. He's just published a very good article on the subject of our seminar tonight in Issues and Studies. We're also joined by Munish Sharma, who's a consultant at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, that are known to colleagues on the call probably as IISS. He's a co-author of a book on Indian cyber policy and co-editor of a book on cyber policy in Asia. Munish will speak first this evening, and followed by Mark. They'll each speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. We'll have a comment session, Q&A session. We'd be grateful if you could raise your hand and vocalize your question when we get to the Q&A session. Please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A function, to comment at any point online through the seminar as we're going through it. If you prefer non-vocal intervention through a question or comment, feel free to use that Q&A function as well, and we'll try and pick that up. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it remains merely for me to, I guess, open the seminar, except I should have introduced myself. I'm Greg Austin. I lead the program on cyber, space and future conflict at IISS. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Munish, could you begin, please?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Austin. Let me just share my screen. I have a short, not short, it's a long one though, presentation. And I did have a limited, some time constraint over here to put this together. So I hope it's visible.
Yes, thank you, Munish.
All right, so I'll then just start on. And so I think the synopsis on this particular subject, which is mainly about looking at China's use of cyber coercion, and the two case studies which I thought would be much more appropriate to study over here could be the anti-terrorist drive against Uighurs in Xinjiang autonomous region in China, and the anti-independence drive against the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. And what I'll do is, as part of this presentation, is just to find out what geopolitical goals we could map with the strategic outcomes for China, looking at it mainly from China's point of view, and what exactly, just try to highlight that the cyber element in these campaigns and why cyber as such makes a very good proposition for China to get engaged or kind of shape these two drives or these two movements in its favor. And then just spend some time toward the end on the success or effectiveness. How do we gauge it, or do we have any parameters to gauge, or just some thoughts over towards the end. And few starting points, I think, before we just hop on to this study, few things I believe we should keep in mind. First and foremost is that is the influence of American thought on China's thinking on information warfare or cyber warfare as such, along with the Russian operations, which we have seen happening all the way with the annexation of Crimea, which we saw in the case of electoral interventions in the US elections in 2016. So American thought, Russian operations is something which has broadly shaped Chinese thought on information warfare. That does not mean that it's recent. I think the thought on information warfare dates quite back somewhere around mid-1980s when scholar soldiers, I would say, like Shen Wei Kuang began writing on on information warfare and tried linking it with psychological warfare, political propaganda warfare, and all those thoughts, which eventually matured in the form of the publication, which is one of the most widely cited, called as Unrestricted Warfare towards the end of 1990s. Eventually, early 2000s, Tai Ching-min, a lot of senior PLA officers, they begin writing about integration of civil and military forces in the information sphere. Along with that, when we had the Science of Military Strategy in 2001, which actually was translated to English in 2005, which the discussion was mainly about bringing all aspects of statecraft within the range of strike. So that made it like open to politics, open to economics, to trade. So everything became part of warfare in that sense. You don't have any clear-cut divisions between what is justified, what is legal, what is not legal, what is political, what is economic, what is what is civilian and what is military. And as we saw towards 2015 with the integration of space, cyber, and electromagnetic spectrum into the form of strategic support force, which PLA raised in 2015, and a few thoughts we did saw about it in 2013 version or edition of the Science of Military Strategy, which did have a specific discussion about these issues. And I think China's thought has a lot to do with what has happened over the last decade and a half, beginning with Estonia and Arab Spring, along with that PRISM. So when we look at Chinese literature, I think these are a few instances which find a lot of mention in the writings, and I strongly believe that they have to a large extent shaped the existing thought on information warfare and cyber warfare. But speaking from a country's perspective who actually has been subject to colonialism, I think China's experience with semi-colonialism 1840 onwards is something which we should always consider when we look at China's literature coming out of China, and then Chinese discussing about sovereignty. So I think when countries do have this kind of experiences, they always have a very they're very touchy about sovereignty in one sense, because any intervention on part of foreign powers to kind of break them apart, or any intervention in the form of separatist movements, is always seen with suspicion. So sovereignty is very safeguarded thing, which I believe countries which have experience with colonialism, they do kind of associate to. And obviously, when Mao said that lagging behind means, or it leaves one vulnerable to attacks, that means that he did not want, this was basically in the reference of nuclear weapons. So he did not want China to be left to intimidation or left to the bullying by powers who did have access to nuclear weapons. So just to set up the premises that how do we look at, or how do I look at cyber, is something based on these founding principles. So let's look at just two cases in consideration over here, and the quandaries which China has over both of them are very much clear. And the military strategy of 2015 captures it, I think, quite well when it speaks about separatist forces for East Turkestan independence, probably, and along with that Taiwanese issue, which again China does reserve the right of use of force along with that, but it has resorted to something called as a peaceful means of resolving the issue. And when the military strategy did mention that Taiwanese independent separatist forces are still the biggest threat to the peaceful development of cross-strait relations, does carry a lot of weight because I believe this actually consolidates a lot of thinking process within China. And so just looking at the geopolitical objectives and trying to map them with a few of the end objectives, just a quick snapshot of what actually happened with Uyghurs in China, and how the institutional settings along with that has evolved over time. And I'm not going much into the history, but let's say 1996 onwards, when the separatist disturbances did pick up and the Strike Hard campaign did kick in, which actually tried to, in Vardabim meant that hit at enemy forces and purify society and educate the masses. So the crackdown follow through actually kind of went towards much more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in which the decision which China took actually in a way spurred violent and terrorist movement further. And it revitalized, kind of aggregated the entire sentiment, which probably would have been much more fragmented earlier. Along with that, it was 2008 a defense white paper, which actually featured independence of East Turkestan and Tibet as one of the threats to China's national security. Taking it on mainly from the time when Xi Jinping took over as president, 2013 onwards, we saw around a whole bunch of terror activities, beginning with the suicide car attack in Tiananmen Square in 2013. Within 18 months, I think we had a whole bunch of terror attacks, not just in Xinjiang, but all the way in Kunming and other areas of China. And followed through was this, again, a strike hard campaign against violent terrorism, which took a military turn in the sense the principles of counterinsurgency they actually started deploying these concepts on its own population. Massive intelligence gathering kicked in, and I'm not going into what exactly is happening right now within Xinjiang, but just to set the premises over here that how things changed after Xi's turn and eventual appointment of Chen as party secretary in Xinjiang, and the repressive measures which he has taken eventually over the years. They are well known, well documented, and a lot of human rights questions have again been raised on that. But we have seen this crackdown and this sudden spur of information warfare 2017 onwards, and a lot of activities which I think do crossover from what China actually calls as re-education towards more of coercion and intimidation. But one thing which does stand out when we look at all these instances of cyber-related incidents linked to whether it's Tibetans or whether it's Uighurs, I think espionage clearly stands out. It began 1999 onwards when Tibetans began reporting about espionage attempts at their communications and their communications, especially email communications and phishing attacks. But I think when in the case of Uighurs, a peak was kind of visible in malware development, which overlapped with the Strike Hard campaign, which actually kicked in 2014. Along with that, we saw these legal measures coming in, whether it was national security law or counterterrorism law, which came into force around 2015. And a lot of interest in a way from tech companies over here. So whether it was Kaspersky Lab, it was Palo Alto or Cyber Reason or Volexity, Citizen Lab, a lot of them, because the access to malware strains was quite easy in that sense. And whatever outcomes they had out of their malware analysis, they were put in public domain. But a lot of it has to do with espionage. Eventually, last thing I want to highlight over here is the last point over here in 2019, what came out to be known is China's attempt to hack into foreign critical infrastructure, especially telecommunication networks over here. I'm considering them to be part of it. This thing stands way out of espionage in the sense that it actually compromises critical infrastructure in foreign countries, first and foremost. That could actually lead to a lot of repercussions if come into limelight, and along with that, if the countries they decide to take action, any retaliatory action in response to that. But this is something which I, as in my previous role, like when I was IT professional, I was looking at was telecommunication billing. And how do you analyze something called as CDRs or call detail records? So the thing is now in the case of espionage, when you look at very targeted, very specific targets and then try to compromise Android platforms or try to compromise iOS platforms. But in that case, it becomes very specific in the sense that it depends a lot on the individual, whether he has visited a specific site in the case of a water holing attack, or whether he's clicked on a malicious link, or whether he's downloaded a malicious attachment. But when you actually have access to the billing system of a telecommunication network, then you have access to this, thousands of people or thousands of users and all the details about them, whom they are calling, how long the call duration had been. So basically, it's much more of a mass espionage or mass surveillance thing in the sense that your data set of the targets actually increases. So you are no more dependent on the individual over here for espionage to click on a malicious link. But once you are into the system, then you have access to a lot of details. So just trying to map geopolitical goals over here. Near term, I have broken it down in two levels, near term and long term goals. So near term, I think for China would be to put an immediate end to terrorist violence. And second in line could be to deter the activities that China in a way perceives threatening to its control over Xinjiang. So that I will also includes a portion of separatists to give up the movement, in the sense that trying to put barriers in their way, in a way that let them suffer, in a way that let them not communicate with others, isolate them, deny international support and sympathy to the movement, which is very important in the case of separatist movements. You have financial sources. So once a particular outfit, a separatist movement is labeled as terrorist organization or terrorist movement, then the international sympathy kind of dries out. So I have personally seen that happening with because we do a lot of we do have, India has a lot of experience dealing with separatist movements and insurgency movements in Kashmir. So this is how the things move. So once you label a specific movement as a terrorist movement, then you try to isolate them and then deny all the support which pours in from international supporters. But this actually serves a long-term geopolitical goal, and that first and foremost has to is to quell separatism and quell the East Turkestan independence movement. And obviously this should be about avoid the splitting of the region. So this completely stands in line with China's concerns over sovereignty and territorial integrity. And a separatist movement, if this one fructifies, then it might actually disintegrate China, and Xinjiang being one of the biggest regions over there will actually, it's just something which cannot afford. And in the long term, it has to be about the economic and cultural integration of Xinjiang with China, and the assimilation of the wider of the specifically about the Uighur identity into the wider Han identity. And this actually was from where the entire crackdown on or the discontentment of Uyghur population in Xinjiang actually begins with. So when China began doing this assimilation exercise 1949 onwards, and then that the practices of changing the of taking in the demographic changes in Xinjiang, which actually rolled in and then snowballed into such a massive separatist movement. And let's now just try to put in the cyber into this equation over here. Who are the targets? Obviously, the political activists who live in or who are in exile right now, and because we are not looking at looking at Uyghurs who are within Xinjiang, especially looking at diaspora and people who are living in exile, it makes more sense because China does not have control over their communications. It has limited control or direct control on them. So what makes more sense is to use cyber tools to kind of tap into their communication to exert that control what China actually wants to exert on them. And at the face value, I think it looks a lot to do with espionage and information gathering. But I think when we look at the wider geopolitical goal, it fits in very well because these low-end attacks, which we could say, especially in the form of taking down websites or trying to intimidate them from stopping or using certain platforms, I think it restricts their freedom of access, especially with free communication media or access to news and other online sources. So we have seen the news websites, we have seen these applications which the Uyghurs use to source a lot of information about their own religion. Along with that, news it's completely restricted because a lot of watering hole attacks against these websites have rendered a lot of people who actually were visitors of these websites, they actually stopped using them. Beyond that, I think it erodes the trust amongst people because once people start becoming suspicious about each other in the group, so they stop sharing information more openly within these groups, or stop circulating information, which actually beats the whole purpose of aggregating the sentiment or aggregating these movements. And moving on to the cost, first of all, these separatist movements, they don't have the luxury of, they don't have deep pockets. So once you start attacking them on a daily basis, you raise their cost in terms of defenses, their cost in terms of technology. We have seen Tibetans moving away from Androids or moving away from Windows to Mac operating system, just for the same reason, because it was supposed to be more safe in terms of the kind of attacks which they were facing. And beyond that, I think one very strong reason, one very pertinent goal which cyber coercion does serve over here is to undermine cooperation with others. So once the leaders, especially once they become wary of these attacks, then they just avoid communication with journalists, with analysts, people who actually do want to participate in these movements, but they are kind of intimidated from sharing a lot of information about their own internal thinking or their own internal thought process about these. So a disruption of online communications and pressurizing Uyghur diaspora, it's whether it's transnational social mobilization networks to give up the movement. So I think these are the much more wider objectives which cyber in a way serves for China. And just looking at its effectiveness, I would say it has. I mean, there is no parameter as such to gauge whether how effective it has been or whether it has been effective at all or not. But I think it, in a way, has backfired in the sense that what we see right now is much more increased international scrutiny, whether it's in terms of human rights advocacy groups or whether it's directly coming in from the UN or through other sources in which now we know a lot about Uyghur movement, what we knew probably 5 years ago, just because of a lot of things which did happen, brought a lot of information from within Xinjiang towards toward in the public domain, and we are much more aware about it. And because of the same reason, I think the international scrutiny has actually picked in. But what these sustained campaigns against Uyghurs or Tibetans, in a way, they have actually made them very resilient to the low-end attack. So their defenses have actually heightened. They are not now they are so well trained that they don't even click on these links which come onto them. So at least they are now immune to, in a way, from phishing attacks. Plus, what has happened, I believe, which has worked in the favor of Uyghurs in this case, is the support of technology companies. And just because they are much more open to engage with them, in the sense that they are so much willing to share the strains, malware strains with them, in a way, a lot of technical reports have given us very deep insights into what China actually is cooking over here, and exposing these cyber operations, which are very much attributable to China, in the sense that especially when we look at the command and control infrastructure, we have seen a lot of domains which were sharing a common command and control infrastructure, which has a very long-term continuing pattern over here. Like some of the domains were in use from 2011 or 2012 onward, which eventually were unearthed and linked to the attacks which surfaced in 2018 and 19. Moving on to the next case study over here about the DPP and its anti-independence drive. A lot of change we have seen in China's approach, I believe, towards Taiwan broadly, if we speak about it, because when we look at the 1996 situation, when they were holding their first presidential elections, and display of military force, the entire cross-strait crisis of 1996, that psychological element of trying to intimidate Taiwan, which has actually watered down to a sense, especially when we look retrospectively in 2020, because starting with the defense white paper, which actually picked Taiwan, has been one of the factors which has consistently appeared in all the white papers from 1998 onwards till 2019, and transition within Taiwan with DPP in power, and then again KMT, which stayed in the power between 2018 to 16 and saw a lot of reapproachment towards China. But I think few structural changes within the PLA, especially speaking in terms of the SSF and the coming back of the return of the return of DPP back into the power in 2016, and its continuum of holding of power in Taiwan, speaks a lot about speaks a lot about how do we look at China's cyber quotient in Taiwan. And then when we look at its assessment, in terms of effectiveness. I think we'll just reflect on that towards the end of this particular segment, but just trying to link cyber in this particular space, in the sense that we saw that espionage was one of the key factors, or one of the prominent factors, which appeared in the case of Uighurs and Tibetans. But these low-end defacements or hacking of websites, I think they actually could broadly be termed as more of nuisance rather than any act of cyber coercion. But when we talk about sustained attacks, when we talk about targeting of individuals, or targeting of leaders from the DPP, or when we talk about um, information warfare campaigns, then I think it's not restricted to nuisance. It's much more beyond that. And what we saw all the way from 1996 onwards, when like till 1996, I think, when the much more focus was on military power, and to focus on to resolve the Taiwan issue using military power, which is to an extent, I think, served a lot by cyber element, which I'll discuss in the next slide. But before that, just some bit of reflection on what exactly has happened. So 1999 onwards, when President Lee spoke about that it should be about the relationship between Taiwan and China should be more of a state-to-state, on a state-to-state basis, and then followed up by Chen swearing in 2000. And this whole this whole onslaught of hacking of websites, whether it's DPP's website, or after that the loss of personal data from National Security Council website or MND's website, along with that, uh, it continued. I mean, whether we speak about APT 16 or infiltrating into DPP staff email communications in 2015, or whether we talk about defacements or hack into personal data or information warfare 2016 onwards, especially when Psy took over. It did intensify around 2018 local elections. And then again, we saw another phase of intensification towards just ahead of presidential election, and it continues. It did not end with that. And even after Tsai took over, a lot of information warfare campaigns we saw coming towards her, just trying to map the geopolitical goals over here. It's basically the target over here in this case has to be DPP, obviously for its objective. The core objective of DPP remains to be creation of Republic of Taiwan, and opposition to what China propounds, the one country and two system, which has been in existence since 1980s, and its outright refusal to accept the 1992 consensus, which definitely was not more of a formal kind of agreement. But near-term goals, if we look at here, would be obvious opposition of independence of Taiwan, or to weaken the separatist movement, which is kind of growing up in Taiwan, and cultivate a more pro-China sentiment that's basically about shifting the public opinion in China's favor. So whatever means it takes, traditional media, social media, or information warfare campaigns, and coerce the opponent. So I think opponents could be DPP or anybody who's pro-independence of Taiwan, to coerce these opponents into submitting to the will of China. And these short-term goals actually merge into something which is very much overt and very well known, is to the ultimate reunification of Taiwan with the mainland China. But I think right now we can consider stopping of independence of Taiwan to be a long-term goal, because the way things are unfolding, I think this could actually be termed as a long-term goal. And obviously the economic and cultural integration with mainland China, which actually paves the way for the peaceful reunification of Taiwan with mainland China. Now, trying to put in the cyber element in this equation, we saw a shift from a tougher approach to a more moderate approach when we saw Hu Jintao taking over from Chiang Zemin. Questionable about Xi's approach over here, but I think it went very well till 2016 in terms of economic engagement and people-to-people context. But once Tsai took over, I think there was a complete U-turn, in the sense a lot of restrictions, a lot of things which actually stopped happening, which try to kind of isolate Taiwan, what we saw of late in terms of diplomatic actions on part of China. But I think the role of military has downgraded to a particular extent, but it still remains to be one of the key factors, in the sense that China has never renounced the use of force or reduce reliance on the use of force. But to an extent, I think if you look at what happened in 1996 and where do we stand right now, I think there is sea change in this approach. And cyber, I believe, fits very well in this particular equation when we look at engineering a complete unification, a peaceful one over here. And picking few leaflets from China's playbook over here, I think what Russians could allegedly could do with the election interference in 2016 in the case of US, and we have seen happening the very annexation of Crimea right before us. So I think putting all of them together, in China's understanding, and then looking at it, it's targeting of DPP over here. So it makes much more sense for China to delegitimize the institutions, the democratic institution, because that is something which differentiates Taiwan from China. Democratic values, institutions, and DPP is it stands as a barrier between China's efforts to kind of bring Taiwan into its fold. And then the weakening of institution we have seen happening through information warfare and disinformation campaign again, especially just ahead of elections, especially associated with the DPP candidates, and sabotaging or eroding public trust or confidence in the candidates who actually have assumed power, or people who have actually come into into leadership position. So discrediting DPP candidates and then eventually once they assume power, and then again continuing those sustained attacks on them, so that people lose their faith eventually, in taking forward Taiwan's economic development or Taiwan's overall social development. Continuing over here, I think we have seen a lot of research going into it, in the sense that two key points which I want to quote over here, one coming from Videm Institute in Sweden and another coming in from IISS in Australia, that how Taiwan has been a target, and especially DPP has been a target of China's cyber-enabled election interference. And it's been sustained, and it's been specifically targeted against few individuals, especially Tsai, and especially against the DPP broadly. But a key point in my view over here is the dual use which cyber serves in this specific case, because first and foremost is if even if you try to look at it in terms of effectiveness, and what happened in 2018 when DPP actually lost the local elections. In that case, I think it worked very well in China's favor, but when it did not work in China's favor in 2020, it actually turned around. China actually turned around into a kind of opportunity, and then started blaming, in the sense, these are the quotes from CGTN in which it clearly says that now DPP is weaponizing electoral interference, and now it's kind of elevating this anxiety surrounding China's exaggerated claims of electoral interference. So it actually works two ways. If it succeeds in manipulating or public opinion, well and good, and if it fails to, then it can always put the blame on DPP, and then try to convince the wider public that it's DPP which is trying to weaponize it as electoral interference, and then trying to put much more curbs on civil liberties, or much more curbs on freedom of expression. And effectiveness, I think the result speaks, the result at least for 2020 election speaks for itself. We saw this support for Han in 2018 midterm election. You can term it partial success to an extent, because I think a lot of investment in terms of support coming in from China went towards Han's favor, and he eventually won, at least in Kaohsiung. But I think in 2020, the sole fact that 50% of the vote went into Tsai's favor stands to the fact that it actually did not work out the way it was supposed to happen if China wanted to repeat what they could do in 2018. But one factor, I think, had been the heightened defenses on the part of China, especially in terms of the proactive measures which were taken by social media giants, and the crowdsourced fact checking, which was very much instantaneous, and it actually saved a lot of damage which actually saved people from a lot of damage which could have been imparted by China. But along with that, I think strengthening of institutions, which has actually helped Taiwan in the long term, beginning with the 2001 itself, and when Taiwan began with the National Cybersecurity Program, which right now is in its 5th phase, and it's continuing 3 or 4 years of programs which have actually strengthened to a larger extent about China's own, about Taiwan's own defenses against these kind of attacks. But again, the joining of forces with the US in 2019, 2019 joint cyber warfare exercise with the US, which actually is based on Cyberstorm, which actually means that cyber actually has given Taiwan another option to plug in what's happening all around the globe, and then get the best practices from countries like US, and probably thwart what China is kind of fomenting in within Taiwan. And towards the end, this is the last slide. I'll just wrap up in 2 minutes. But I think when we analyze cyber, it's very difficult in the sense that there are first and foremost no parameters. We don't know that how do you gauge the success of it. We don't know whether it was actually China behind a specific cyber campaign or not, because attribution always remains questionable. But I think the distinct, very specific and peculiar political settings, organizational settings, or the military settings, what you call as, and along with the historical experiences, they should factor in when we look at cyber as when we try to factor cyber in geopolitical goals. And the success of cyber campaigns does not necessarily dependent upon the party which is waging cyber campaigns. I think it depends a lot now on the party which is actually facing these attacks. So heightened defenses, we saw Taiwan, we have seen that happening with Tibetans who have become quite a lot resilient to these low-end attacks at least. And it also runs the risk of misdirection, and always the difficulty of ascertaining whether, in terms of secrecy, we have very limited public information available about these cyber operations. So it's always difficult to ascertain the success, in the sense that the very fact that cyber is very unlikely to be used as a standalone means, like it will always be blended with, it will always be used in conjunction with political, psychological, or economic factors. So I think that makes it much more difficult for us to look at the success of a specific, or of the success of cyber espionage, cyber campaigns as such, because we cannot dissociate them from other factors. And looking at least in terms of timelines, I think with cyber campaigns having no start or end points, I think it's always difficult to gauge their success, in the sense that we don't know when did they start or when did they end effectively. And especially their low and their long-term or far-reaching effects. So when we speak about information warfare as such, which may not bear results immediately, which has very long-term effect or very far-reaching effects, I think it's very difficult to gauge the success or effectiveness of cyber campaigns in that sense. So I'll end here, and over to you, Professor Austin.
Well, thank you, Munish. That was an excellent presentation. I think you've exposed some rather under-researched issues in terms of China's international behavior in cyberspace. So thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to turn to Mark Manantan. Thank you, Mark. Just unmute. Yeah. Mark, you need to unmute. Tom, can you help Mark unmute, please? There we go.
Right.
All set. Thanks.
It's getting pretty late in Manila, so so it is with great pleasure to be joining today's webinar on Chinese cyber coercion. Special thanks to Professor Greg Austin for the kind invitation. And so in talking about Chinese cyber coercion, one of the most prominent events was the hacking of 2 Vietnamese airports in 2016. It was suspected that Chinese-backed group 1937 CN was behind the offensive messages that you see on your screen that appeared on the information screens at the international airports in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, while public announcement systems broadcasted a similar derogatory message. This comes at the height of the landmark ruling won by the Philippines against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. For today's presentation, I aim to provide a deeper understanding on China's evolving approach to cyber coercion in achieving the PRC's strategic ends and an appraisal of its effectiveness and impact. In doing so, I shall start by first unpacking the conceptual dimension of cyber coercion, followed by a discussion on China's approach to its cyber coercion playbook. And from there, I will examine two case studies, Taiwan and the South China Sea. And the final section offers some concluding remarks and also a way forward for Chinese evolving approach to cyber coercion. So to start off, to really give an understanding of what is cyber coercion, there are two works that are very much relevant that define cyber coercion by Valeriano and his colleagues. It is defined as the use of manipulation, denial, and punishment strategies in the digital frontier to achieve strategic ends. But like other coercive diplomacy, cyber coercion achieves maximum impact when it is combined with other tools. Meanwhile, Hodgson and his colleagues at Grand Corporation define cyber coercion as the threat, either implied or implicit, or the limited use of cyber operations to motivate a change in behavior by another actor that may involve cyber operations on their own or in conjunction with other coercive actions. The deployment of cyber coercion is quite complex given the mixed signals from the coercer and the mismatch on the corresponding response or absence of response from the coercee. The cost-benefit analysis framework has always been used to measure the success of cyber coercion, where success is achieved if the target capitulates to the desires of the coercer. But other scholars contend that it is not necessarily the case. In most instances, even instead of capitulation or compliance, the threatened state actor or the threatened actor or the coerced state resist by increasing their defenses, and even others trying to ignore the coercion itself. That is why it has been observed that cyber coercion is employed in concert or in coordination with other tools. But despite these mixed assessments on the success and effectiveness of cyber coercion, it remains a critical tool given its strategic currency. Number one, cyber coercion provides intelligence gain or has this effect of intelligence gain or loss dilemma, or obtaining access to one's network or system. Threats inject fear and doubt to achieve psychological manipulation. This presents the cognitive aspects related to cyber coercion, where the coercer does not only exploit the physical and the digital dimensions of cyberspace, it also capitalizes on the permissiveness of political, economic, and diplomatic and social unrest. Cyber coercion also serves as a tool that is short of a cyber war. It falls within the threshold of armed conflict, although it establishes a level of credibility that it could get worse for the coercee if it doesn't change its action. It still does not provoke any military confrontation, but it offers the possibility for the coercing state to achieve its strategic goals without actually igniting conflict. China's approach to cyber coercion embodies some of these fundamental ideas, but given its evolving role in international politics as a contributor and a disruptor, it has modified its approach to suit its strategic ends. To dissect China's approach to cyber coercion, it is essential to revisit its notion about conflict in cyberspace and how it views cyber as an asymmetric capability, and also how it utilizes cyber coercion in coordination with its political, economic, and diplomatic levers to establish the credibility of its coercive threats. So just to establish, the PLA doesn't really use the term cyber operations. The PLA used the term network operations or information operations, which is the rough equivalent to what we use as cyber operations. But at the core of China's concept of network operations or cyber operations is this omnipresent struggle, a Marxist-Leninist philosophy, which depicts its clash with the West's political systems and ideology. The publication of the Science Military Strategy in 2013 revealed how China sees no distinction between wartime or peacetime or violent or non-violent. This reflects the anxiety of the Chinese Communist Party towards regime security and survival, blurring the lines of violence and non-violence underscores the CCP's perpetual conflict with the West, which shows its expansive view on what constitutes national security that rests on ideological domination. For the CCP, cyberspace has become a new ground for contestation and an important tool for statecraft, where the end goal is to achieve information network dominance, meaning the PLA must continuously use information systems and capabilities to achieve an operational advantage, either in conflict or non-conflict situations that will deny such capabilities with the adversary. Chinese experts believe that there's really no difference between violent and non-violent perspectives. The former, which occurs in the battlefield, is characterized as limited in scale, while the latter, called the deterrence war, occupies the majority of the space and time. PLA analysts contend that the enemy is most vulnerable during the early phases of war, and thus necessitates the effective launch of preemptive strikes. This drives the PLA to conduct network operations to craft preemptive strategies prior to the actual breakout of conflict. In recent years, China has embarked on a serious defense modernization campaign. It has consolidated its military force for all the domains involved. But one may wonder, why does cyber or network operations continue to be a centerpiece to China's strategic arsenal? Xi Jinping views the internet as an ideological battlefield, and the party's view of survival depend on how it's shaped. It's not only the physical or the digital aspects of cyberspace, but also the information that binds human interactions and perception. During the party conference in 2016, Public Opinion, Xi argued that China must increase its discourse power to enhance its status in the world stage. This involves rapidly integrating information warfare, network operations, electronic warfare, along with its three warfares to influence the behavior of the opponent, and will reinforce China's political and diplomatic struggle, and also in the event of future wars. Therefore, the rapid expansion of network operations to include information warfare have implications on China's evolving cyber coercion strategy. And third, completing our understanding of Chinese cyber coercion is this concerted effort by the PRC to capitalize on its political, economic, and diplomatic assets, especially its state-owned media mouthpiece, to establish the credibility of its threats. Noting how cyber coercion at times could send mixed signals, the PRC seeks to use other tools to direct the message to the target or the coerced, to the coercee or to the coerced state. Using the recent incidents related to the elections in Taiwan and the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, let us examine how these three concepts of conflict, capability, and coordination or coordinated is implored. So starting off with Taiwan, in the weeks leading up to the presidential inauguration, three major Taiwanese companies from the energy, finance, and tech sectors were hit by coordinated malware attacks. In the months, similarly, in the months leading up to Taiwan's highly anticipated 2020 elections, Taiwan experienced 10 to 40 million cyber attacks per month, with which authorities said that it's becoming more and more impossible to really confront such intrusions. In terms of capability, we now see this integration of network operations into a more of a broader information warfare. It started after a landslide victory to secure another second term. President Tsai Ing-wen was immediately targeted by hackers linked to Beijing. Strangely so, legislators from the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party contend that the cyber attacks aim to disrupt Tsai's presidential inauguration. But more than that, we now see a hack and leak cyber attack where four emails were sent to local Taiwanese media from an account named Thai Loser, which described the friction happening between Tsai and her close aides in the DPP. In 2015, a similar incident happened when Chinese state-backed group APT-16 infiltrated DPP's staff emails and security protocols. Attacks were also very sophisticated in nature, in a sense that the phishing emails were sent to key individuals in academia, not just only in government, but also in academia, and non-governmental organizations that supported DPP's standing policy on Taiwan's de facto independence. The rise of Tsai Ing-wen's rival Han Kuo-yu from the Kuomintang party is also a great example of this ongoing integration of network operations and information warfare from China's cyber coercion playbook, where we see the support of cyber hackers who are based in Taiwan upping the profile of Han with an unofficial Facebook page, and these hackers or called diehard fans also generated likes, shares, and comments, and prophesized the victory of Han and propelled fake news and disinformation campaigns against Han's opponent in the primary. Such malicious content has also been shared in Line, which is a popular messaging app in Taiwan. In coordination, the cyber coercion tactics of China does not end in terms of cyber espionage and phishing emails. In the lead up to the elections in 2020, the People's Daily suggested that Taiwan will lose all of its diplomatic ties if Chai wins another term. And to illustrate its commitment to its threat, Beijing lured the Solomon Islands and Kiribati with economic enticements. And within just a span of 1 week, Taiwan lost two of its formal relations, living with only 15. And so since Chai Ing-wen also took office in 2016, China has also suspended all high-level exchanges and restricted tourism travels from the mainland to the Self-Ruled Island. Going to the South China Sea, which the territorial dispute among ASEAN member states, even in the middle of the pandemic, the majority of Southeast Asian countries were not scared from cyber attacks. Interestingly, in May this year, Nikon was detected after going silent in 2015. Nikon is an advanced APT group associated, it's a Chinese-linked APT group who is implicated in conducting 5-year cyber espionage, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in countries such as Australia and other parts of Oceania. It specifically targeted foreign affairs as well as science and technology departments and ministries, along with government-related companies, to gather geopolitical intelligence. Nikon actually resembles a campaign back in 2016 called Nanhaishu, where it targeted, Nanhaishu is also an advanced persistent threat campaign, where it targeted the legal team representing the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration to provide Beijing a leverage in formulating a preemptive strategy in the aftermath of the arbitration case. Similarly, in 2015, Far Eye published a report detailing the espionage of hackers, Chinese-linked hackers in Southeast Asia who are targeting oil companies who are conducting offshore oil exploration in the disputed waters. The PRC has a deep-seated interest in the hydrocarbon reserves in South China Sea, and this will guarantee a sustainable future energy to sustain China's economic growth. In terms of capability, we also see information warfare becoming an important tool for China to push for its agenda in Southeast Asia. Very recently in September, Operation Naval Gazing, a study conducted by US research firm Graphica, identified Facebook pages that boasts candidates such as Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte to win in terms of a pro-China stance, in terms of his position in the South China Sea, and also his views on the US-Philippine alliance. And the Chinese disinformation campaign promoted types of politicians like Duterte. And strangely, interestingly, the Operation Naval Gazing was also conducted way back in Taiwan in 2016, where it also advocated for Taiwanese politics, mainly on pro-mainland reunification. Similarly, the cyber coercion in South China Sea or Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines, is done in coordination with other tools such as trade and travel restrictions. At the height of the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012, banana imports from the Philippines were faced hurdles coming into China, and there were also travel restrictions that were imposed by Chinese authorities for Chinese coming into the country. So what does this say about looking at Taiwan and the case of the South China Sea? Some 3 critical points surface. The first one is information warfare is really becoming a part of China's cyber coercion strategy, along with network operations. Hack and leak and information campaigns that promote particular politicians or parties that are pro-China will continue to persist. This will elevate China's foothold towards foreign interference overseas. Social media platforms and online messaging applications have become critical hotbeds for PRC and its proxies to spread fake news, incite conspiracies, and prosecute political actions. There has been a growing traction within the PRC to capitalize on the ongoing political, economic, and social discontent, and to undermine the overstability of countries in Southeast Asia and also in Taiwan. We also observe this continuum of compellence and deterrence in cyber coercion, where compellence or deterrence begins or ends is not always clear-cut, and at times they're even mutually reinforcing. This allows, again, Beijing, going back to Beijing's thinking on network operations, to craft a preemptive strategy and or adapt an offensive stance against its adversaries, whether in war or peacetime. Whenever tensions are high in the South China Sea, Chinese-linked APT groups resurface as signaling mechanisms that put claimant states in the region or the entire region that they are under Beijing's watch. These groups are lurking and are actively involved in data mining for Beijing to gain preeminent advantage in the negotiation table, such as the case of the ASEAN Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Having access to geopolitical intel ahead also allows Beijing to up the ante of its threat impositions at varying degrees or levels. Third, although China is very proactive as a cyber actor, it remains circumspect in using network operations that is below the threshold of armed conflict to avoid any inadvertent escalation or damage. Such an observation does not diminish the strategic leverage of the PRC cyber coercion tactics in creating the intelligence loss or gain dilemma, nor its resolve and commitment to further escalate the current threat. In fact, it perfectly captures the psychological warfare dimension as the defining pillar in China's strategic doctrine, which is stipulated in official documents and media statements. And with the weak cyber capabilities of countries in Southeast Asia and Taiwan, China is able to experiment on its network operations, which it can combine with information warfare. And so moving forward, I think China as a very well-resourced actor has the capability to experiment on its approach on cyber coercion, whether using AI-infused hacking tools or leveraging on its new technology companies like TikTok or Huawei to advance its strategic gains. The increasing integration or expansion of the cyber coercion playbook that embraces information warfare will provide China greater flexibility. We also see China flexing its ability to interfere in the elections or democratic processes of other countries to suit its interests. The flourishing of China's digital Silk Road initiatives will give China more control in the critical national infrastructure, specifically in countries in Southeast Asia. Access to broadband networks for energy or transportation can be used directly by China to impose implied or direct threats. But we also see the increasing role of non-state actors such as Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, and other private cybersecurity firms exposing Chinese activities. But as Chinese tech companies like TikTok and WeChat compete with US tech titans, we would also see or expect how Chinese cyber coercion could evolve to promote CCP's interests. As China continues to expand its influence in the region, cyber coercion will remain a hallmark of its to achieve its strategic ends, but solely relying on network operations will no longer be sufficient. China will continue to use other tools within its disposal to sharpen its coercive tactics and prosecute its global ambitions. It will amplify its efforts to exploit social unrest through a broader information warfare to promote its strategic narrative anchored on the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, a true marker of China's approach to coercion in depth. So how effective is China's cyber coercion? I think the answer is more nuanced. Tsai Ing-wen and DPP must have won the election, but understanding the strategic doctrine of China, the fight is far from over. It's still where China still has not, the PRC or the CCP has not given up in using military confrontation as an option. In terms of South China Sea, I think China got more than what it wanted a few years back. It has now greater leverage in the negotiation table in terms of the ASEAN Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. It also can leverage its Belt and Road Initiative to lure, have a more wider grip towards the critical national infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And also its strategic understanding of strategic corruption, supporting politicians for potential foreign interference. So this widens the aperture and also the myriad of opportunities and options for China. Thank you very much, and I'll yield the floor to Professor Greg, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mark. I think that your presentation is a wonderful complement to the presentation by Munish. I think you've put a lot of interesting questions on the table. We have 3 questions that have come in through the chat function, so I'd just like to put those 3 questions to you both. Please feel free to answer 1, 2, or 3 of them. So let me just go through those. From Eduardo Menez, we have a question about China's public diplomacy and the relationship between what you've been describing and China's public diplomacy. And specifically, that question asks whether the Chinese government is well established on a path to thought shaping of international audiences through the use of artificial intelligence. So that's question 1, public diplomacy and artificial intelligence. The second question from Nicholas McLean asks about China's use of cyber coercion in Hong Kong. Can you comment on that in the same way that you've commented on the case studies that you mentioned? And then a third question from an anonymous attendee, and we're very grateful for the question. What does independence look like in these areas that you've been talking about? If I can interpret that question a little bit, perhaps mistakenly, but I think it's driving at the proposition that China's threat perceptions are extreme. So while independence in some respects may be a genuine endpoint of some of the opposition groups, if it's not a reality or it's not an immediate reality, is China overreacting? So this is an extreme threat perception. If I've misunderstood the intent of that question, please feel free to correct me in the chat function. Okay, Munish, do you want to go first with whichever of those questions you'd like to address?
All right, yeah, I think the question on public diplomacy, I believe, which I think, yeah, it makes public diplomacy is kind of China's approach. Like it's the only way in which China can, portray its positive image about or kind of legitimize its actions, especially in Xinjiang. Because I forgot to mention about these 2 specific campaigns which were run by CGTN, which is much more of outward-looking communication arm of the state. So two of these videos, which were around I think 45 to 50 minutes longer, which try to highlight China's fight with terrorism. So I have not taken the snapshot for presentation purpose, but I think the whole idea was to educate the international audience. So when you are making a presentation when you are making a video in English, which means that you're targeting the international audience. And if you look at the media coverage, what China has on Xinjiang specifically within China, obviously it has to be positive. That's the whole purpose of controlling the media. So I think public diplomacy obviously is something which I believe CCP has kind of mastered the art. So whether it's inward looking for within China or whether it's in the form of its English audience, I think it's done an amazing job in the sense that I do follow Xinhua English news along with their CGT and Twitter, and I think the kind of videos which come out of the propaganda, they're just amazing. I mean, they're beautiful. So in that sense, I think they do a good job in complementing cyber with information and public diplomacy fits very well within that narrative. Moving on to the question of AI, I think I just missed it, what it actually was regarding to.
For thought shaping in target audience internationally.
Yes, obviously it should be used. I think if they do use AI to such an extent, especially during the entire COVID crisis, I think it would be, if somebody has got such a capability lying within that, and especially with a country like China, who actually is so much careful about its international image and standing, I think it ought to be used. And we know very well now the way AI has shaped. Now we have seen news articles which are being written by algorithms. So I think in a way that, yeah, it could be. And just to mention that those articles were actually pretty good as compared to the articles which come from few of the media houses. I think in that sense, probably eventually as AI learns going forward, it will start writing much better articles which are specific, targeted the specific requirements to just build those echo chambers for people, so that it just kind of reinforces their preconceived notion. And then whether it's about, just to make sure that the right message goes to the right audience. Second thing about independence, about what was it about the scope of independence or what independence will look like. So I think if I speak from India's experience, so I'm maybe a little diverting over here, but I think these are two very fundamentally different cases when we speak about Xinjiang or when we speak about if we include Hong Kong along with this, and obviously Taiwan being the third one. So Xinjiang is very much an autonomous region of China. So I think independence for Xinjiang as such I don't see it happening. Second thing, the second case of Taiwan, I believe it's actually a kind of de facto state. So I believe that changing political borders in 2020 is very difficult. And I believe you have to be Russia to do it, or you have to be Russia to pull that thing through what they could do in Crimea. So I think changing political borders in that sense, if we are speaking about independence for Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or if you're looking for independence, Taiwan practically is independent. The only question remains to be about, the diplomatic identity for Taiwan. So I think in that sense, if we look at both the issues, or even if you want to add Hong Kong along with this, then I think status quo will kind of sustain in at least the two cases which I have discussed.
Thanks, Munish, that's great. Mark, do you want to have a go at those questions as well, or would you like to take on some that we can see in the chat function here?
I'll just take the question for the public diplomacy and AI, I think.
Go ahead.
I think just to answer the question of public diplomacy, I don't really think that China, I definitely think that China currently, given the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, that its public diplomacy is really in shambles. We now see the unraveling of its wolf warrior diplomacy and how it's done. It has unveiled throughout the world. And I think the perception, there was a study that was released by Pew Research that the negative perception of China was an all-time low, which is comparable to the Tiananmen Square. And also, I think even in the party itself, there was an article that was published by Reuters that the party itself is also very much concerned about its current stature in the world, given the downturn in China's perception. And I think we see China not taking the high road, but the low road. I mean, the low blow, because we've seen that instead of really addressing wolf warrior diplomacy, it has become more aggressive in its information warfare, not just in the South China Sea, but also throughout the region. In terms of the question about will future developments of consumer algorithms and AI further enhance China's power to control? Yes. I've mentioned in my presentation about TikTok. And just to give you a particular background, President Trump demanded ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, to sell its US operations and divest its investments. But China released its export control, which covers AI, which is at the heart of TikTok, the code that allows people, to find a video that suits their interest. And so I think in itself, TikTok is a political actor that we have to watch out for because of that AI piece within TikTok that will allow the PRC to dictate the strategic narrative now on a global scale. And TikTok is now in competition, level playing field with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google. And so China will not only exploit Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google, but it already has TikTok. It has already expanded again its tools for cyber coercion.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Uighur, you have your hand raised. So let's take your question, and then I'll pick up a couple of questions as well from the chat function. So Uighur, we're going to vocalize, and then I'll pick up a couple.
Thank you. My question actually is to the panelists as to what is the assessment at present about the effectiveness of the digital belt and digital BRI. And given the kind of thing that they have talked about in terms of China's cyber coercion, what are the practical difficulties are actually being seen in terms of furthering the Chinese agenda in building the digital BRI, considering the fact that they require the permissions, etc., from the foreign countries where these these infrastructure would be laid? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Uighur. Well, that ties in very neatly with the question from Lane Burdett. Thank you, Lane. How might Chinese cyber coercion extend to undersea internet cables and infrastructure projects by Huawei or under the BRI initiative? So colleagues, Mark and Munish, perhaps Munish, you go first on how can China actually use these relationships established under BRI and the Digital Silk Road? or coercive?
Well, especially when talking about the digital part of BRI, I think it fits very well within China's overall cyber diplomacy, I would say, in that sense, because first and foremost is the point which we should keep in mind is that digital BRI may have got a new twist and turn, especially 2014-15 onwards, but I think Chinese companies have been operating in most of these countries from quite some time. So a lot of these projects which were existing in terms of, in terms of extending infrastructure, in terms of laying down optical fiber cables over there, or at least building telecommunication infrastructure, I think they were very much present, especially if you look at Huawei and ZTE. It's just a new political, I would say, jargon which has been created over here in terms of digital belt and road. But I think it does consolidate a lot of cyber diplomacy elements in the sense that it gives China a kind of leverage once it starts building its own standards, or once it starts, forcing these countries to adopt China's own standards, technology standards. So I think it is paving a kind of a way. It's laying down the road in the sense that eventually, when we're talking about 5 years down the line, especially, or looking at long term, even if you talk about China's standards 2035, I think it's very it fits neatly in China's strategy of building, or kind of I would say shooting away from the existing structures of technology, of building, or of I would say what do you call a setting of international standards. So in that sense, China can easily take off and take a different route altogether. And there is a proverb also which says that taking over by changing lanes. I think something, if it correlates better over here, then I think it actually gives it that extra lane, or to take over, or to push ahead, or to go ahead of the existing international technology standards platforms. And I think, over to you, Mark, if you have to add anything.
Right. I think in terms of the question about the digital BRI, I'll take a different approach. I think digital BRI is the same as the BRI. I mean, you have the Hamantoba port in Sri Lanka, and also the 5G and Huawei and ZTE also is the equivalent in terms of the digital aspect of it. And I think the problem, or the practical challenges, is that in countries in Southeast Asia, in developing economies in Southeast Asia, they don't have any risk assurance strategy or certification strategy to certify a particular company if they are really compliant with, they have really fulfilled the security measures required, that a company will not conduct cyber espionage. And that's the problem with Chinese companies investing in countries in Southeast Asia. And so I think that really sets a lot of challenges for countries to really assert, and except for Singapore, who is very technologically savvy. And I think aside from lacking risk assurance strategies, we also see how Chinese state-owned companies are using handmaidens, foreign partners, to really infiltrate or penetrate or circumvent foreign investments laws in the country to get a grip of digital infrastructure.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Well, so we have a question from Emanuele Farrugia. Would you like to vocalize that, Emanuele?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Manantan, and thanks for his exhaustive and quite interesting briefing. But we would like to ask why we don't call a spade in a way, and we continue to use, like in the previous seminar, the term cyber coercion, when it is maybe we can call it cyber warfare. Now I think the discussion is focused on information warfare and cyber espionage and psychological warfare, and what is but in the light of the Chinese science of strategy, which sees apparently no distinction between peacetime and wartime, wouldn't it be more proper to deal with it as full spectrum cyber warfare? Thank you.
Thanks, Emanuele. Could we add to that another question about Chinese strategy? Quite a different question, but still at the level of strategy. What kind of retaliation is China likely to face from its aggressive cyber activities? And I guess what goes with that is, does China take account of possible retaliation? So, Munish, do you want to go first on this? Well, Mark, do you want to pick up the science and military strategy question first? How does it treat cyber coercion, information warfare? Anything further to add on that? And then maybe a question of, does China fear retaliation in cyberspace? Then we'll go to Munish. Thank you.
I don't really have a direct answer to why cyber coercion and these certain terminologies that China uses in terms of how it's dealings in cyberspace or information space. And I think cyber coercion has really become more of it has a broader, it casts a wider net compared to what is a cyber warfare, given that cyber coercion goes beyond the physical and the digital aspects, but also includes the cognitive aspects or the information environment. So for me, I'm still researching this. This is not a definitive answer, but it's a more of a wide cast net rather than just really concentrating on cyber warfare, because as we've discussed, it also includes other tools like diplomatic, political, and economic and other levers that is available.
Thanks. Do you want to comment on the retaliation question? Does China fear retaliation for these activities in cyberspace? Does it plan on retaliation? Does it plan that other states will retaliate?
I think we've seen Vietnam sort of not retaliation, but also trying its hand in terms of cyber espionage. I think there was an attempt by this advanced persistent threat group from Vietnam that tried to find out what's happening in China in terms of after the outbreak in Wuhan. And so I think from a small state perspective, like Vietnam, I think it sets a dangerous precedent because if that is the case, will it be able to handle the pressure if China really unleashes the dragon of its cyber or its network operations?
Thanks. Munish, did you want to comment on that retaliation question?
I believe it depends on the adversary. So if we are looking at probably Uyghurs in that and like Uighurs in that sense, I don't think China actually fears much of retaliation, first and foremost. And I think if cyber coercion is one of the strategies what China pursues, or actually it's apparently pursuing against the US, I think then definitely retaliation will definitely be part of its cost benefit analysis. And I believe, I'm not able to recall the exact scholar, but when this thought about information warfare was fomenting in China in early 2000s, there was a strain of thought in which the scholars were actually, thinking about the likelihood of it spilling into the other domains. So in that sense, what if China is not able to control a specific cyber operation and then it escalates into a full-blown brawl? So what do we do in that case? So I think there is definitely, there has been a thought process, especially on the likelihood or on the possibilities of a cyber war going out of control. So in that sense, I strongly believe that, yeah, obviously when somebody is pursuing cyber as part of its military strategy or cyber as part of its coercive strategy, then definitely the cost benefit analysis of it being going out of control definitely remains to be on the cards.
Thank you, Munish. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3 really good questions on the table to probably take us through to the end of the session. So let me put those out so that we can have a look at those. The first question from an anonymous attendee relates to the observation that China has learned from Russia. Questioner is asking, what's our evidence for that? And is there any element of cooperation between Russia and China, including training? That's the first question. Second question, also from an anonymous attendee, is China exercising similar coercive behaviour toward Western non-state institutions, brackets, companies or academia? So other similar behaviour towards Western non-state institutions. Third question is a rather exciting military indicators of warning type question from Toby Rowe. Was there any evidence before the outbreak of the confrontation, recent confrontation in Aksai Chin? Was there any prior evidence of preparation of media messages, or was it only follow-up and sort of catch-up, so to speak, after the confrontation broke out? And the related question is, do you see cyber operations as a possible indicator of follow-on concrete action, such as, I guess, what we saw in Aksai Chin? So there's 3 very interesting questions for you, Munish and Mark, to wrap up. Do you want to kick off, Munish?
Can I have Mark first? Because I just need to read the question on Aksai chain. It's quite lengthy. I'll just read it through in the meantime. Please, Mark, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
No worries. For the question about Russia, I think I do get a lot of this comment that China learned a lot from Russia, and I definitely agree with that. But let us also take a step back a little bit and see the stature of China and Russia. China is an emerging power at par with the United States, and Russia is it's in decline. And I think what really makes China more a sophisticated cyber or information warfare actor is the fact that it's more well-resourced. Again, I would argue from the perspective of China has more. If you look at TikTok, if you look at WeChat, China has more its own tech companies that it can use to further its cyber espionage or information warfare. Not only limited to TikTok or WeChat, but also with Huawei and other Chinese tech companies. So in that essence alone, China has an greater advantage to do experimentation towards its approach. In terms of China's exercising similar coercive behavior, I see this recently and play out a lot in Australia. I think just to be very specific about it, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, has been really at the very center of issue lately, where I think there were analysts within ASPI who are being barred to enter China already, or there are also news about ASPI analysts that are going to be tried, a legal complaint has to be filed. And so I think Australia at the moment, as we see unfold the trade war between China, I don't want to call it a trade war, but the trade debacle between Australia and China, I think it's also a manifestation of how the coercive behavior of China towards Western non-state institutions.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Anything on Aksai Chin from you, Mark?
Yes, please, definitely. I think it's a very tricky situation in the sense that when two armies are standing eyeball to eyeball, and it could unfold in any way. So I think when we if you look at and then try to discern whether it was completely managed or pre-planned, or the particular segment over here, whether it was preparation of media messages prior, or it was in the aftermath. In a sense, it's very easy for China because the answers or the media positioning is standard. It's right out of the playbook. It's like, for example, even in terms of casualties, it's not gonna go out. I mean, the numbers at least, or in terms of what exactly happened, in whether how many lives were lost or how many actually have been hurt. So those numbers will never come out. Even the number of casualties from Vietnam War, they just came out recently. So I think the casualties from 1962 war with India, it has still not come out. So I think it was very easy for them to manage because when two armed forces, when two completely charged units, they just engage in more of a confrontation, which is more of hand to hand. It could swing in any way. So it's too difficult to say whether it was the media handling was prepared prior to it or after that, and once the incident has happened. It's too difficult to say in that sense. But coming on to the question of learning from Russia, I think no credible evidence in that sense to suggest that actually they borrowed from Russia's playbook. But if we look at the kind of attention which was drawn towards 2018 Taiwanese local elections, I think it was clearly in line with what Russia actually was allegedly accused of in 2016 election in the US. So I think if we just look at the circumstantial evidence over here, just look at why there was a change in China's approach compared to 2012 elections. If we just try to look at them retrospectively, I think you can actually draw those loose connections that they could have actually learned from 2016 campaign, which Russia did. And I think on the next question, the right person would be Professor Austin, because he knows better about US, China, and China, Australia in that particular segment. So maybe if you could have some thoughts on it to reflect on this question. I'm behaving as chair over here. So.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, we have one last question that's come in. So if you'd like to express your views in 30 seconds or a minute, please do so. it's important enough to just put it on the table, even if we can't address it in detail right now. And that is, what would China be expecting from the Biden administration in terms of its efforts to curb China's coercive operations in cyberspace? 30 seconds worth or a minute, Mark? Want to go first?
I think the Biden administration will be focused, I think, for the next 2 to 3 years more on the domestic issues of the United States of America. But I think there is also a momentum within the Biden administration, as he has penned in his own essay in Foreign Affairs, that he is willing to cooperate on China, on areas where converging interests arise. And so we see a cyber diplomacy pact between Obama and Xi Jinping a couple of years ago. And so I think there is also, Biden might also pull out the folder from there and see where potential cooperation might prosper.
Okay, thank you. Munish, 30 seconds or a minute?
No. I don't. I mean, I don't follow it so well, so I don't think I can answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we might wrap up. Thank you very much for your presentations. I think you've given us a lot to think about. This seminar has made a good contribution to the IISS project on cyber coercion. So I look forward to keeping in touch with you both on it. Colleagues in the audience, participants, please feel free to be in touch on this subject if you'd like to know more about our work and maybe exchange some ideas. To finish off, colleagues, I know it's not usual, but could we have a little round of applause to express our appreciation for Munish and Mark? Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, we'll sign off. Thank you.